costume designer and costume shop manager here at NC State University Theater. Welcome back to the spring semester, spring 2021. We all survived 2020, so jazz hands for all of us. We are back with a whole new series of how-to theater, and we're super excited to be able to revisit some topics that we visited back in the fall when things felt maybe a little more chaotic. So then we've had a time to rest and we can relax into these things. And we are also going to be visiting some new and exciting topics. So please make sure you check out our website, theater.arts.ncsu.edu. And that's going to have the listing of all of our offerings from the costume shop, the scene shop, and all over our theater space. So please be sure to join us throughout the semester. So this week, this is our first how-to theater of the semester. We are going to be doing some hand sewing basics. And we have restructured our how-to theater series a little bit in order to safely serve the students of NC State. So we are going to be harnessing our think and do mentality. So the first how-to theater is going to be the think part, and that's what we're here right now. We're going to be learning how to do these things. And then next week, you're going to have the opportunity to come in and do the thing. So we have a limited number of spaces available, but students can sign up on our website, and that is theater.arts.ncstate.edu, or I'm sorry, .ncsu.edu, and sign up, and you can actually come into the shop and do the things that we are thinking this week. That's going to be throughout our entire series, both up here and in the scene shop throughout the semester. So there's a lot of opportunity for students to come in and get some hands-on activity and get out of your dorm room. We will be, of course, following NC State community guidelines with face coverings and physical distancing. So we are making it as safe as possible. So let's get started. Our time is limited and we've got a lot to cover. So first, we're going to be going over some basics. We're going to go over the different types of tools that we're going to want to have on hand for our basic sewing kit. This is our no frills, just the things that you need to survive as a sewist, as a maker, as somebody who works backstage, as an actor, somebody who works wardrobe. You're going to want to have this stuff on hand. And it's just a few really simple, basic sort of tools. So the first thing that we want to make sure that we have on hand are scissors. And if you come into the costume shop, if you're working in the costume shop, you're going to run across two different types of scissors. We're going to have our paper scissors and our fabric scissors. And you'll see lots and lots of jokes about sewists and customers guarding their fabric scissors with their life. Definitely do not use fabric scissors on anything except fabric. Paper scissors you can use on just about anything as long as the scissor will cut the thing. And so the reason why we keep two separate types of scissors available to us in the shop is that the fabric scissors, if they are used on paper or cardboard or metallics or sequins or anything that runs the risk of dulling the blades of our scissors, the blades are going to get nicked, they're going to get dulled, and they're just not going to cut nicely. And there's nothing more frustrating, frankly, than trying to cut with dull or chipped scissors. You're not going to get a clean cut. You're just going to throw the project against the wall and run out in a huff. I have done that. So that's why we keep these two separate types of scissors separate from each other. All right, the next thing we're going to want to have on hand is a seam ripper. And so a seam ripper is what we use when we make mistakes, because we are human beings and every human being makes mistakes. So a seam ripper, there we go, is a really fun little tool. It has a pointy end here. It has a little U right here, and that little U has a tiny blade kind of carved into it, and then this ball point here. And what we do is we're going to use the seam ripper to take apart any mistakes that we may make, or when we need to do alterations, the seam ripper is going to be the tool that's going to help us take apart the clothes, take apart the costumes so that we can do those alterations properly. So having a good seam ripper in your kit is a really, really handy thing to have. I think every professional sewist has a preferred brand that they like, but making sure that inner blade stays sharp and making sure your pointy bit stays pointy, that's really, really important. These do need to get replaced on a semi-regular basis. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to rip out your seams. Oh, and I forgot, I'm so sorry, I forgot. We have Adrienne McKenzie here on camera. She is operating the camera and she is also on chat in the webinar. So she is monitoring the chat. If you have any questions, go ahead and type them into chat and Adrienne will read them out loud to me so that we can get those questions answered for you. I cannot multitask to save my life. So I have Adrienne here to help me out. So thank you, Adrienne, super appreciate. Thumbs up. All right, so from our seam ripper, next we're going to go on to our measuring devices. We have a ruler and we have a flexible tape measure. And so both of these, even though they're measuring the same thing, they're calculating our inches and our centimeters for us, inches, centimeters, they're still going to operate in different ways. Our flexible tape measure is generally what we're going to use to take measurements on a person, on the human body, because it is flexible and it can go around things like that. So we can get an accurate measurement around curves. This can also be really, really handy if we are measuring around a curve on a pattern or on a garment. Whereas this little ruler here, this is a solid plastic flexible ruler. So you can see it has a nice, strong, ridged edge. And so we can use this as a straight edge to draw lines, to draw nice straight lines, or to measure along a straight line. So even though these are both measuring inches for us, having both of these in our kit is a really, really helpful tool to make sure that we have the proper tool we need to measure what we need. You definitely don't want to try to take measurements on a person using our flexible ruler here because it's just not going to make you happy. You're going to want one of these flexible tape measures here. All right, so next we've got pins. Pins are going to be what hold our things together in order so that we can sew up our costumes. Here we use these little magnetic pin cushions because they're really easy to just kind of throw a pin in the direction and it picks it up for us. Also, if you drop a whole bunch of pins, you can just run the magnet over the floor and it's going to pick up those pins for us. But you can also use an oldie timey pin cushion, a little pillow, a little pin cushion like your parent or grandparent might have had. And you're going to run across different types of pins. And the two kind of basic types you might run across are going to be, ooh, there we go. There we go. Adrienne is so good. So we're going to have our full metal pins, our standard metal pins. And then these, they're typically called quilting pins with the big plastic ball on the top. And the choice between the two really does come down to personal preference. Typically, I personally prefer the quilting pins just because the ball is a little easier to grasp onto. But the problem with the quilting pins is that because this head is plastic, you do run the risk of melting it if you accidentally run over a pin with the iron. So you want to make sure that you're getting all of these little ball-headed pins out of your project before you run it under the iron. Or if you need to iron something while it's pinned, you're going to need to use one of these metal-headed pins. And that's going to be safe to iron over. It'll be a little hot when you're done, but it will be safe to iron over. So you want to make sure you're using the right pin for the job. And there are lots and lots and lots of other types of pins for specialty fabrics, silks and thicker pins for really thick fabrics and that sort of thing. But these are going to be the two kind of basic ones that you're going to run across in most costume shops or in most sewing kits. All right, what do we got next? Needles, 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 needles. So just like pins, needles are going to come in all shapes and sizes, but you're going to need to find the needle that is both right for you and right for your project. So I have two different types of needles here, just so we can see kind of the difference between these two. The first one I'm going to show you is the one that we prefer to use here at in the costume shop at State. We typically are going to use the crewel needle because it has, let's see if I can pull one out here. They get stuck in their little papers. There we go. We'll see this a little more clearly once we start demonstrating our hand stitches. But the crewel needle has a longer, wider eye. And the eye is going to be that little hole there at the top of the needle that you stick your thread through. So if we look at the eye on the crewel needle versus the eye on these, what are called sharps, you're going to see that the sharps have a much smaller eye to them. There we go. Can we see that? Oop, oop, there we go. We're trying. Okay. So this has a teeny, teeny, tiny little eye to it, which just can be really, really challenging to thread if you're tired or if you're new at sewing. So the crewel needles tend to be a little easier for beginner sewers or tired sewers, frankly, to work with. So the other thing that you want to take into consideration when you're choosing your needles is going to be the size. So you can see this here is labeled as size 9, and this little pack of sharps was labeled a size 6. So basically the size is going to be the gauge of the wire that is used to make your needle. So the smaller the number, the wider the gauge, and the higher the number, the thinner or the smaller the gauge. It's a little counterintuitive, but you're going to want to make sure that you're choosing the right needle for the job. Smaller, thinner needles are going to be better for very fine fabrics like silks or chiffons. Wider needles, larger needles are going to be better for thicker fabrics like cottons or wools or linens and that sort of thing. And the reason why you want to choose a needle that's going to be an appropriate size for your fabric is that you want to puncture the fabric or go through the fabric at just the right kind of puncture width so that it's going to be able to pull the thread through without tangling too much. If your needle is too small for your fabric, it's not going to make a big enough hole and your thread is going to get all knotted and tangled and you're just going to be super frustrated. So it can be a little challenging to find the right needle for the right job. But typically, if you want to have just a 1 or 2 packs of needles in your kit, you're not really doing a lot of sewing, somewhere mid-range like these size 9s that we have here, generally going to be good enough for most jobs. You don't want to have a really, really thick needle like a 6, just in case you're trying to repair something that is going to be a little finer. So you want to make sure you have the right needle for the job. And I'm going to put this one away because I am not going to use the teeny tiny eye because I am blind. I cannot see. There we go. So I'm going to take out my crewel needle, stick that over there for the future. All right, so next, we've got all of these tools around us. We need something to actually sew our stuff together. So we need thread, right? So we've got a couple of different types of threads here in the costume shop. And the first type is going to be what you may have seen in a parent or a grandparent's sewing kit. It's just a standard spool of thread. It's a spool of thread, right? Yeah, we've all seen a spool of thread. So This is a standard spool of thread. In the costume shop, we're going to use these skeins of thread called silamide. And the reason why we use these skeins for most of our hand sewing in here is that these come in pre-cut lengths, so we don't have to worry about cutting the right length. And they also come pre-waxed. You're like, well, why does my thread need to be waxed? That seems kind of silly. The reason why we wax our thread is, again, when the needle is going through the fabric, when the thread is going through the fabric, it runs up against resistance. The thread is catching and pulling on that fabric that it's going through. So the wax is going to smooth that thread so that it goes through the fabric cleaner and easier, and your thread is much less likely to knot, and it's much less likely to get tangled. You're like, well, what if I don't want to carry around a whole bunch of giant cardboard skeins of thread? Then you can take your regular spool of thread and carry around a piece of wax. They sell these little beeswax circles at your standard sewing store. You can buy these. This one is very, very old, but they never really go bad. It's beeswax. And all you're going to want to do is pull off your length of thread. Snippy snip there. And then you're just going to run your thread over your beeswax like so. And you're not going to coat it really, really thickly. We're just getting a little coating of wax on that thread. And that is going to make that thread a lot easier to work with. You'll be a lot less frustrated. So make sure you find yourself a little beeswax disc to go ahead and throw in your sewing kit, and you'll save yourself a lot of angst. All right, the last thing that we really want to have in our kit are going to be marking tools. And so we have, I'm going to put these over here. So we have a variety of marking tools available to us. If you go to your local craft or fabric store, you'll see markers and pens and pencils, and there's a whole rack full of marking tools. The ones that we like to use in here are going to be our standard #2 pencil. We keep these nice and sharp. And if on things like cotton and linen that is of a lighter color, this is actually going to make a really, really nice mark that tends to wash out very, very easily. So if you're marking up something that you know is going to go through the wash, or something that you know that the markings are going to be hidden on the inside of the garment, standard #2 pencil is honestly a really good go-to for that. The other thing that we like to use are these marking pencils. And this is a pencil that has a chalk base on the inside. It acts just like a pencil, obviously. It looks like a pencil. Runs through your standard pencil sharpener. But this chalk base is going to transfer a little more easily to darker colors. If we use the white pencil here, it also comes in pink and blue, which transfer a little more easily to lighter colors as well. And again, it tends to wash out pretty easily with a little detergent or soap and water. But you do want to make sure that you are testing whatever you mark onto your fabric to make sure it's not going to bleed or it's not going to be visible through your project. And the last really common one that you see are these little discs, or these little pallets of chalk. And these are super oldie-timey. These have been around for hundreds of years, but they work really well, and that's why we keep them around. But this is a very, very fine pressed chalk. It's a little more fine-grained than, say, your chalkboard chalk. It's a little denser than that. And if you break these, or if you have a sharpener on these, you can get a really, really fine, crisp line. Or if you have kind of a duller edge here, like we have on these, you can get a really bold line. The problem we've run it, not problem, but the thing that we have to be careful about is that the pigmentation in these does not tend to wash out as easily as the chalk marking pencils or the number 2 pencil. So this tends to work really well for tracing around something that you may be cutting out, or something that you don't really, you're not going to see the markings. You're not going to see the markings. It's not going to get washed. It's not going to bleed. But you do have to be careful about these because these do have the tendency to stain. So you just want to be a little careful. There are lots and lots of other options available, but these are the ones that we find work best for us. All right, do we have any questions, Adrienne? No? Awesome, cool, thumbs up. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to switch to our overhead projector here, and we are going to go through some stitches. And let me check my time here. Boop, boop. Okay, great. So we're going to go through a series of basic stitches that are going to be really helpful for you just as a person, as a human being who has clothes and might need to repair them every once in a while. And also if you end up working backstage, or if you're an actor, you find yourself in a situation where a costume needs to be quickly mended before it can go to the wardrobe crew, or if you're on wardrobe crew, then these are stitches that are going to come in really, really handy to help the show go on as it always needs to do. So we're going to go over some basics here. So I'm going to switch cameras here. Boop. Look at that. Oh, technology, y'all, technology. All right, so we're going to go through the running stitch and the back stitch. And these are going to be our two really, really quick and dirty, like something needs to get repaired super, super fast, and the actor needs to go on stage in 30 seconds sort of stitches. The back stitch is a little stronger than the running stitch, but if you legit have 10 seconds, a running stitch is going to have to do. We have all been in that situation. It happens. So we're going to go through both of these. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to thread our needle. And again, I'm using that crewel needle because my eyes are very old. Let's see if I can do this without taking my glasses off. All right. And so for these, since we want these to be really, really durable, we're looking at these as repair stitches. We're going to do something called doubling up the thread. And so what we're going to do now that we have threaded our needle, so you can see I've got the short end here in my left hand and the long end's kind of dangling there. Oops, there we go, dangling there off the side. And I'm going to pull until my ends meet up together, like that. So I've got my two ends of thread meted up here, and that the needle is down on the other side in that loop from where the thread has folded over itself. And so what I'm going to do here is I am going to knot my thread just by doing a really quick little square knot. So I'm going to make a loop with my fingers. I'm going to take this tail end here and just wrap that around the loop 2 or 3 times, like that. So you can see I've got that wrap around the loop, and then I'm going to very carefully give that a little tug and create a knot like that. I'm just going to snip off this tail a little bit so it's not all dangly, and that is going to be our knot. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is the running stitch. And the running stitch is going to be, if you've ever seen a cartoon or maybe even a movie where somebody is sewing and they're doing the in and out and in and out and in and out and in and out. That is our running stitch. It tends to be what people think of when they think of sewing. So with our running stitch, what we're going to do is we are going to start from, I've got a little folded over here a bit, so we're going through 2 layers of fabric here. So we're pretending this is kind of like a hem of something, hem of a pair of pants or skirt or whatever that needs to be repaired. And so what we're going to do is we're going to come up through underneath that top layer of fabric. So we're going to hide our knot like that. And then we're going to go down through the fabric right next to that fold over. Pull that through. And then we're going to come back up through both layers of fabric right where we went in the first time. And all that's doing is locking our thread in place. That knot is doing a lot of the work, but by locking our thread in place like that, we're making sure that this little friend is not going anywhere. And from here, all I'm going to do is follow this little stitch line that was created by this row of overcast stitching here. And I am going to sew these two pieces of fabric together using a running stitch. So what we're going to do is we're going to go forward about 1/4 of an inch, go down through all the layers of fabric. Cut there, like that. And then we are going to repeat that from the back side and come up like that. And that is all there is to the running stitch. The stitch is used, if you're using it for repair, it had better be a quick and dirty repair that you legit cannot take more than 30 seconds to do. This is not a very strong stitch. You can see it's not really, it doesn't have a lot to hold onto. It doesn't have a lot to grab onto. We're just making this little dashed or dotted line of stitches here, like so. So that is pretty straightforward, like that. The other thing that this stitch can be used for is what is called basting, where if you are putting together a project, if you're sewing a project and you need to temporarily sew two pieces of fabric together, either because it's very slippery and the pins aren't going to hold it in place when you run it through the sewing machine, or you just want to very quickly test whether a couple of pieces are going to go together or a garment is going to fit, you can use this basting stitch, this running stitch, to very quickly and temporarily put two pieces of fabric together, knowing that you're going to rip these stitches out using your seam ripper here momentarily. All right, so that is our running stitch. We're going to pretend that we got all the way to the end here because nobody wants to watch me do a running stitch for that long. And now we're going to knot off. So we did our little lock stitch here at the beginning. We have our knot under there. We need to do the same thing at the end here, or else all of our stitches are going to fall out, right? So we're going to mimic what we did down here at the beginning here at the end. So we came up, so our needle and thread here are on the top of our project, whatever our top is. Now we're going to go down through that single layer of fabric right next to the fold. We're going to create that little perpendicular line. Oops, thread's going to get all caught up. There we go. And now we're going to come back up through right where we went in the first time. And now we're going to slip our needle underneath that little stitch that we just made and create our knot. You can also kind of slip your needle into the fabric itself. You don't want to go through both layers of fabric, but you can slip your needle under there as well. And so what we're going to do when we do this, we're not going to pull our needle all the way through. We want to make sure that we're holding on to this loop of thread before we pull it all the way through. So I'm pulling. You can see how that's creating that little loop of thread there. We want to bring it down to about a $1/2 size, maybe a little bigger than a 1/4 size, somewhere around there. Now to knot, what we're going to do is we're going to take our needle, we're going to put it inside our loop of thread. So you can see I'm going inside like that. And now I'm going to wrap the needle around that loop of thread 3 times. And you can see how it's creating a little candy cane, creating a little barber pole right there on our needle. And now what we're going to do is we're going to move the needle over to my left there and pull it out very gently. And we're still holding on to this loop of thread. And the reason why we want to hold on to that is that the tension as we pull our working thread against the loop is going to make sure that knot works its way down to the fabric, nice and easy. So if you kind of drop that loop and you drop the tension, sometimes the knot will knot itself like way up here, and that will be really frustrating. So you want to hold onto that loop and then hold onto your working thread that's still attached to the needle, and very gently give that a little tug. You can see how that loop's getting smaller and smaller, and eventually you have to drop your finger, and we have a very tidy little knot right there at the base of our stitch. So that is going to be how you're going to knot off on all of these hand sewing stitches. And from there, we're just going to take our needle and we're going to insert it into the fabric in between our 2 layers of fabric, and then come on out and pull. And that's going to hide the tail in between our 2 layers of fabric, and then we can snip just like that. So you can see that little tail of fabric is very tidily hid in between our layers of fabric. We can see the shadow from the back here. We can see the shadow from the front here, but we don't have any little tails hanging out that are going to be annoying or are going to catch on anything there. All right, so that is going to be our running stitch. So the next stitch that we're going to do, kind of the next step from that, is going to be what's called the back stitch. And the back stitch is going to start off the same exact way as our running stitch did. So we're going to thread our needle, we're going to double up our thread. Oh, y'all, I cannot thread a needle without my glasses off to save my life. Boom, there we go. All right. So we're going to thread our needle, we're going to find our 2 ends, we're going to double up our thread and do our knot. Boop, boop. There we go. And so the back stitch is a much, much stronger stitch than our running stitch. And this is going to be the one that you're going to solid go-to stitch if you have to do quick backstage repairs, especially if something has broken in a catastrophic sort of way, as things can do from time to time. So this is going to be really, really strong. It may not be the most delicate looking stitch, but it will do the job, and it's going to get you to where you need to go to make sure your actor can get where they need to go. And so here, I'm just going to use the same little piece of fabric here. I'm not going to do my little locking stitch here at the beginning since we already went through that. I'm just going to hide my knot right here. And to do this, I'm going to rotate my fabric a little bit. This makes it, for me, spatially, this makes it a little bit easier to kind of work with. So we're going to work from left to right here. What we're going to do is we are going to go forward again about 1/4 inch, just like we started our running stitch. And then we're going to go from back to front another 1/4 inch, just like we started the running stitch. So it looks just like the beginning of the running stitch, but now instead of going forward, we're going to go backwards. So we're going to go back and go down through our original entry hole there. And now, oops, thread keeps getting caught. And now we're going to go forward and come up about 1/4 inch away from where we ended off, and then go back again. So basically, we're doing a series of interlocking stitches, creating a solid line here. And it is a really, really strong stitch, especially if you're using smaller stitches. This can be really strong, really durable, and it's a really great stitch to use for those backstage repairs when something needs to happen very, very quickly. And you can see how fast this goes kind of once you get into the rhythm of it. Just like that. And that is going to look about the same on both sides. So we have a strong, solid line going across our fabric. And that is going to be our back stitch. So I am not going to knot off so that we can move on, but you would knot off just like you did for our running stitch. All right, the next stitch we're going to do is called the whip stitch. W-H-I-P, whip stitch. And this stitch tends to be used quite a bit in the costume shop, both upstairs, both in the shop when we're constructing costumes, and also backstage when you're doing repairs. It is a strong and durable, but it can also be a really delicate stitch. And the way that we execute this stitch is going to make it almost invisible from the front of our project. So we're going to pretend that this is the hem of a skirt or the hem of pants. And so we've got our hem folded back here. This is going to be the inside or the wrong side of our project. And this is going to be the outside or the right side of our project. So that is the overlay of what's happening here. We're going to use this red thread again, but instead of doubling up our thread like we did for our back stitch and for our running stitch, we're going to use a single layer of thread. So we are just going to take one of these little tails, pick one. My needle's being stubborn, y'all. It's being real stubborn. I'm just going to switch needles. Sorry, y'all. My thread got tangled around my needle and it'd take me longer to untangle it than it would to thread a new needle. Boom. All right. So we're going to use a single layer of thread. So we have our single tail here, and we can do our knot in the same exact way as we did for the other two, just using a single layer instead of that double layer. So we're going to create our loop, and we are going to wrap the tail around the loop 3 or 4 times when you're doing a single layer, just to make sure your knot has enough substance. And you're going to give that a little tug to create our little knot there. And you want to snip off the tail end. And so when we're thinking about holding onto our needle and holding onto our thread, when we're doing a single layer of thread, you want there to be a short tail and a long tail. And so your short tail should be about half the length as your long tail, like that. And the reason why we do this is we want to make sure that we're giving ourselves enough thread to work with, but also so that we're not tangling our thread up on itself as we're working through. The other thing that I probably should have talked about earlier, but I didn't, so I'll talk about it now, is how do you hold your needle and how do you hold your thread to make sure that your thread is actually going to stay put, that it doesn't fall out of our needle. Because remember, we're not tying our thread to the needle. The other end, the other tail is loosey-loose right over here. So we want to make sure that our thread, our needle is not going to become unthreaded as we work our way through. So typically what I like to do is to hold the needle so between my thumb and my forefinger of my dominant hand, and I tend to hold it about halfway down the needle, pretty close to the tip. You don't want to be right on top of the tip like that, because then you won't be able to get through the fabric. But if you're all the way back here, especially on longer needles, you're not going to have the hand control. You're not going to be able to kind of get into where you want to go. So you're going to find kind of the sweet spot on your needle to hold it so that you can run it through the fabric and also so you can control it. And then with my remaining 3 fingers here, I'm going to let the thread just kind of very gently run across my palm, run across my fingers. I'm going to take those and kind of cup them around the thread like that. And we're not holding tight, you know, we're not putting a death grip on this poor thread. We're just gently cupping it so that it has a little bit of tension to it, and so it doesn't kind of fly all over the place. So it stays where it wants to stay. And that's going to make sure that it doesn't fall out of the eye of the needle. That's also going to control the thread a little easier so that, you know, as we're working with especially a new piece of thread that tends to be a little longer, we have some control and it's not getting in our way. So that is how you hold your needle and your thread. All right, so for the whip stitch, we're going to turn our fabric so that it is running away from us. I'm going to work with my fold to my right because I am right-handed here. And we're going to lock our thread just like we did for the running stitch. So we have our little perpendicular line right there. Our thread is nice and locked and it's not going anywhere. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to move our needle about a 1/4 inch forward, and we're going to take just a teeny tiny little stitch out of the fabric right next to our fold back. So you can see we've got our fold back right here. You can see the edge there that's kind of covered in thread. We're going to take a teeny tiny little pinprick stitch going straight across, going perpendicular here to our fold back. And we're just going to pick up the teeny tiniest little, boop, 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 there we go, the teeny tiniest little stitch there. We're picking up legit like 1 or 2 threads out of this fabric. And from there, we're going to slip our needle underneath our fold back here and go up through that fold back. We are not going through the outside fabric on that second half of this stitch. So we're going through the outside fabric on the right hand side of that fold back, but to go finish the stitch, we're going in between the fold back and the outside fabric, just like that. And we're going to pull that through all in one swoop like that. And now we're just going to repeat that over and over. So we're going to pick up that little single stitch, and then we're going to go in between our layers there, going perpendicular to our fold back there. And so the reason why we're doing it like this is we want to make sure that we are picking up enough of this outside fabric that our hem here doesn't necessarily fall out, but we still want these stitches to be teeny tiny and almost invisible as from the front side of our project. So the back side should look like this. We should be creating a nice little series of diagonal lines that are of even length and evenly apart from each other. And then just picking up the teeny tiniest little stitch of our outside, oops. See, I screwed up. I picked up a big old stitch of my outside fabric. You can feel it. So I'm just going to pull that out. Boop. You can feel the thread running through the fabric and against your hand as you're running or as you're sewing. It becomes pretty intuitive. And so what this does is that this is going to create this, again, series of little diagonal stitches. And this is a really, really common stitch for hems, especially also if we're tacking down facings or collars on the inside of a garment. This is a really popular one as well. It's really good for straight lines like this. And we're going to go over the stitch that works a little better for curved lines here momentarily. So we can see the back of our project looks like these little candy canes, these little diagonal lines. And the front of our project, we can see those teeny tiny little pinprick stitches going across our garment here. And the reason we use red on our ivory fabric here is so we can see those stitches as we're working them, so we can see what we're doing. But you can imagine if this was done in a white or done in an ivory or a matching thread, these stitches would be near close to invisible once you get this garment actually on a human being. So your whip stitch is going to be a really, really great stitch to use for hemming and for doing repairs, tacking down facings, tacking down sleeves, that sort of thing. It's a really, really great, useful stitch. We use this one quite a bit. All right, how are we doing? Do we have any questions? Awesome. All right. So the next one we're going to do is called the cross stitch. And I'm not gonna lie to y'all, this is a very satisfying stitch. It is just fun to do. And when we teach these stitches in stagecraft, our students seem to really enjoy this one. It looks way more complicated than it actually is. And that just makes people feel really good when they learn how to do it and they learn how to do it well. So with the cross stitch, you can, depending on what you are stitching in place, you can either double up your thread or use a single layer of thread. I'm just going to do a single layer today just for ease of demonstration here. And so the trick with the cross stitch is that we're going to be creating a series of interlocking stitches that look like a little range of mountains going across our fabric here. So we want to make sure that we are holding our fabric to make it easy for ourselves to put these stitches into place. And we also want to make sure that we are holding our needle and our thread properly so that the stitches actually overlap each other and interlock. And it's that interlocking function of the cross stitch that really gives this stitch its strength. This is a really, really popular stitch for hems again, and especially on curved items because it tends to be really, really strong, but also really flexible. So it gives things that are sewn on a curve a little more space to kind of move around and to wiggle and to settle into place in really appropriate ways. So we are going to start we're going to sew from, let me think about this for a sec. Our stitches are going to move from my left to right, but our needle is going to move from right to left. So let's demonstrate how that works. So I'm going to do my locking stitch here first at the beginning, just kind of get my thread locked into place. And so from here, what I'm going to do is I am going to take my needle right next to that fold back, so the same place where we did that little teeny tiny stitch for the whip stitch, and I'm going to again pick up 2 or 3 little individual threads of our fabric here and run my needle from right to left. So you can see this is the pointy end of the needle, this is the eye end of the needle, and we're going perpendicular to the fabric, right to left, right underneath that fold back. And we're pulling that through. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do that same right to left motion up here, just going through the fold back. So here we've got 2 layers of fabric, and we just want to go right to left, only going through that folded back fabric. We're not going through that front layer of fabric. And we're going to pull that through. So you can see this is the first top. This is our first little mountain peak. And as we move our thread forward, you can see how that thread crosses over itself. And that's how we get that interlocking stitch. And that's why it's called a cross stitch. So from here, we want to keep our thread out of the way. We're going to go right next to the fold or underneath the fold. I'm going to pick up that 2 or 3 little pieces of thread in the fabric, right to left, pull that through. And so this is a fully executed cross stitch. So we can see we've got our little mountain peak. And we're going to continue to do that across the fabric. So we're going right to left, making sure that our thread kind of stays above our project or to the right of the project so it doesn't get tangled up. You want to make sure that you're always executing that crossover, because that's where the stitch really gets its strength. Right to left, boom. Right to left. And so we're just keeping that thread out of the way. And so this is a really great stitch. Like I said, it has a lot of flexibility. It has a lot of strength because it has that crossover. And it's picking up more fabric than it actually looks like it's picking up, because that crossover is really, really helpful. And it creates just this very satisfying little mountain range going across your project. And once you get into the rhythm of it, it actually goes relatively quickly. Just like anything else, hand sewing takes practice. And you want to make sure that this is something that you give yourself the time and the energy to practice. It's a great thing to do while binge watching your favorite Netflix series. I have watched probably too much TV over the pandemic. And I've also done a lot of hand sewing while watching all that TV. So this is going to be our cross stitch. This is a really, really great flexible stitch. All right. Next, we're going to go over some closures. And so closures are going to be the things that hold our clothes together. And kind of the three big ones that we use in the costume shop are going to be buttons, snaps, and zippers. We're not going to go through zippers today. Zippers tend to be a sewing machine thing. Adrian is giving me the thank you face. Zippers can be really challenging, but they are very, very useful. So the first thing we're going to go through is, what are these things? What are these things? What are buttons? What are snaps? And how do they work? We all kind of understand the mechanics. We all have clothes that have buttons. Snaps are a little less common nowadays, but I think we've all snapped a snap. And so, but there are different types of buttons especially, and there are different types of snaps as well. But the two types of buttons that we run across are going to be a standard or a flat button. And that's going to be, again, if we think back to our cartoons, or if somebody told you in Pictionary to draw a button, I would be willing to bet that you would draw a circle with 2 or 4 little holes or little dots in it to indicate little holes. This is what we think of when we think of button. And so this is just a standard flat button like that. The other type of buttons that we see that we use quite a bit are called shanked buttons. That's S-H-A-N-K, shanked buttons. And so the difference between our standard or flat button and the shanked button is that the shanked button, you can see, doesn't have any holes on the outside. It is a solid, this is a metal button, this is a solid piece of metal. But if we flip it over, it has this little eyelet attached to the back of it that kind of sticks out from the bottom of the button. And that little eyelet is called the shank. And so the purpose of the shank is, it gives us the opportunity to have buttons that have a solid face on them, so we can have a design, or so we have a some sort of a design feature or color feature that is not broken up by thread and it's not broken up by these holes. But the shank is also holding that button away from our fabric. So you can see, if we're pretending my finger is, this is a pretty big one, so pretend my finger is a big woolen coat. And so when we sew this shanked button onto our big woolen coat, that button is going to stand up away from that fabric. And the reason why we do this is because if this button was sewn flush against the fabric, so if there was no space, it looked like this, I cannot use my fingers, instead of this, then there'd be no place for the fabric to go, right? There's no place for the buttonhole to sit in. So the button actually has to stand up away from the fabric just a little bit. And it depends on what you are buttoning. So this is a larger button. This would be a suit jacket button, maybe. Probably not big enough for a heavy winter coat, but you know, a pretty solid shank here. So this is going to accommodate a much thicker piece of fabric. There are some buttons that have a more delicate shank that are going to be appropriate for finer, smaller fabrics. So you want to make sure that you're choosing the right button for the right job, and that when you create your buttonhole or you are replacing buttons on a garment, that you're choosing a button that's going to give you enough space to actually use it. So what about this little friend right here, our little Pictionary button, our little standard button? Our little Pictionary button doesn't have a shank, right? It just has, these 4 little holes. So what we need to do is actually use our thread to create a shank underneath this button when we sew it on. So we are going to do that together here. So let me get a new piece of thread here. And I'm going to thread my needle. And once I thread my needle, I am going to double up my thread, just like we did for the running stitch and for the back stitch. Closures, we are generally going to double up our thread because closures take a lot of stress, especially in the theater. If you think about, you know, when you're tired and you get home from work and you're changing out of your jeans or your slacks into your sweatpants or leggings, you know, all you want to do is just take those off and put on your comfy clothes. And so we tend to pull on buttons really, really, really hard, and we put a lot of stress on them. And in theater, actors are putting even more stress on their clothes than we do in kind of our day-to-day lives, because they are doing a lot of physical activity. They're really exerting themselves on stage. And a lot of times actors have to change out of their clothes very, very, very quickly. So we want to make sure that their buttons and their snaps and their zippers are going to continue to work throughout the run of the show. There's honestly nothing I hate more than seeing a note about a button that I have to replace on a Saturday morning. I would much rather stay home and drink coffee with my dogs. So we're going to show you how to replace buttons so that they are really, really sturdy. So the first thing we need to do is we need to figure out where our button is going to go. So here, I'm just going to mark with a pencil. If we had a buttonhole that we were matching this up to, we would mark the center of that buttonhole when the garment was closed. But we're just going to mark that. And so here, first thing we're going to do is create a base for our button. We want our button to stay on, so it needs a little bit of extra space or a little bit of an extra base to hold on to. So we're going to come from the back of our project, and we're going to go up one edge of our little circle, and we're going to go on a diagonal line, and we're going to go down across the other edge. And then we're going to hit the other 2 quadrants of this little dot, basically creating an X. We're just doing a little, if you do cross stitch recreationally, we're just doing a little cross stitch here, or making an X out of our thread. And from there, yeah, you can kind of see my little X. We're going to come straight up through the center of that X, bringing our thread and our needle to the front of our project. And so this is going to give our button a really, really solid base to hold on to. So our thread is not going anywhere. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is sew our button in place. And what we want to do is make sure that we are leaving enough space in our thread for the shank. We're actually going to be creating that shank out of thread. So we're going to hold our button so that the center of our 4 little circles here is right there at the center of our X. And this first kind of bit when you're sewing the button on it's a little finger yoga. It can be really challenging. You want to make sure that everything is staying in place. And in order to give ourselves enough space for the shank, we're actually going to hold a pin on top of that button. So we've got a little button sandwich with our straight pin or our standard pin here, our button underneath. Our thread is coming up in between our fabric and our button. And so we're going to go up through the hole. Oopsie, it's hard. It's hard, y'all. I'm gonna hold that in place. And then we're gonna go over the pin and down through the hole directly next to it. And pull that through. And we're not going to pull our thread too tight. The pin is there just to help us create the shank, but we also don't want to pull our thread too tight or else our shank is not going to exist. There we go. And we're going to go up and down through that single set of holes 6 times. And that's going to give us a button that is nice and strong without being kind of too crazy. Once you get the first couple of stitches there, the pin is generally going to stay in place. Mostly. There's nothing more exciting than watching somebody sew on a button, I'll tell you what. All right, so once you've gone up and down through your first series of holes 6 times, then we're going to transfer ourselves over to the second series of holes. And you want to do that from the back of your project. You don't want that overlap thread to be on top of your button. So we're going to move our thread over. And go down through the hole. So we're making a little equal sign with our thread here. And again, we're not pulling this thread too tight. We want to leave ourselves some wiggle room so that we can create our shank. All right, and once we have gone up and down 6 times, we want to end that part of sewing on our button with the needle and thread on the back of the project. Now we can pull out our standard pin and kind of give our button a little pull, a little wiggle. And if we turn our project to the side, we can see that there's kind of this mess of thread underneath our button, and the button is standing away from, there's space in between the button. Let's see if I can do this. There we go. There's space in between the button and the fabric there. It's not a lot, but it doesn't need to be a lot. This is not a really big button. And so now our thread and our needle are on the back side of our project. Our button is on the front side of the project. So the next thing we need to do is called wrapping the shank. So to do that, we're going to take our thread from the back side of the project and we're going to pull our needle in between the fabric and button. So you can see how it is coming out in between, underneath the button, but on top of the fabric there. So we're going to pull that through. This part is so satisfying. Yes, Adrienne just whispered, this part is so satisfying. It really is. It all just kind of pulls together. So now our thread is coming out in between our button and our fabric here. So now we're going to hold on to this working thread. Our needle is just going to dangle there. We don't have to worry about the needle for now. And we're going to hold on to this working thread pretty tightly, and we are going to wrap the thread around that big old mess of thread, 7 or 8 times, and give that a really good, honestly, a good little tug. You want this shank to be nice and firm. If there's loose thread under here, it runs the risk of that actually catching when the actor or when you actually use the button. So you want that shank to be wrapped really, really tightly. So you can see here, I have pulled all of that thread into one tight little bar and wrapped it really, really tightly. So that is called wrapping the shank, and it is super, super satisfying. And what that does also is that helps our button stand away from our fabric, just a scooch. Doesn't have to be a lot, just a scooch. And once we have wrapped our thread, now we need to knot off. So we're going to kind of twist our button to the side here, and we're just going to take a tiny little stitch underneath the button. You can kind of edge into your shank there a little bit, pull your needle through, and this is going to be where we're going to do the same thing. We're going to make our loop with our thumb. We're going to insert our needle into the loop. We're going to wrap it around 3 or 4 times, and we're going to pull through, holding onto the tension on that loop until we have to drop it, and then pull out or pull our knot through. And the last thing we want to do is, if we have 2 layers of fabric here, we want to make sure that we are hiding our tail, just like we did with the first stitch that we do. That is extra important when we're doing buttons and snaps and closures, because if you think about kind of how a button works, you are constantly pulling on it. It's constantly getting a lot of pressure. And those teeny tiny little knots that we have tied in this thread, if we snip our thread right up against that knot is eventually going to work loose, and our button is going to come loose and it's going to fall off, and everybody's going to have a bad time. So what we want to do is just give that knot just a little bit of breathing room, a little bit of space, so that it has a place to go. And so what we're going to do is just hide our tail in between these 2 layers of fabric. Oops. There we go. So we can't see that from the back. We can't see that from the front. We're just hiding that tail. I usually give it a good ½ inch or so. 5 minutes?
No, 10 minutes.
Oh, 10 minutes. Okay. And then snippy snip. There we go. So that is our button. All right, the last thing we're going to go through, and I'm going to try to do this really fast, is snaps. And so this is usually when some stagecraft student makes a corny snap joke. My repertoire of dad snap jokes is not as good as it should be, so insert your own snap joke here. All right, so here we're going to double up our thread again, and we're going to start off just like the button. The challenging bit with snaps is that they are 2 parts, 2 pieces, and you want to make sure that you're sewing these 2 pieces on correctly. And so let me see which one shows up. Yeah, Sylvia shows up better. All right, so these are our 2 snap halves, and you can see that they look kind of similar to each other, right? Especially if you take this one and you flip it over, suddenly those look totally the same, right? And so what happens is that it's really easy to grab this snap, sew it on upside down, and then go grab this snap, and you're like, oh, this is not going to work. This isn't going to snap together. So the trick is to identify the 2 halves of a snap. These have traditionally been called the male and female half. Language is evolving as it does, and it's what seems to be more prevalent now is to call these the positive and negative sides of the snap. So use a terminology that you are comfortable with, but language is evolving, which is exciting. So the positive side of the snap is going to be this flat backed snap. So you can see it has a little rod that sticks up in the middle. And if you flip it over, the back is perfectly flat. So if we lay that on a table, it's not going anywhere. It's not wibbly wobbling. It is not a weeble. It does not wobble. It does not fall down. So this is going to stay nice and flat like that. The negative side of the snap is much curvier. So the top has almost a domed effect. And if we flip it over, this is where people tend to get confused. This can look like the positive side of the snap. But if you look really, really carefully, there are actually two little springs here on the inside. And those little springs indicate that this is the negative side of the snap, and that is the part that's going to be sewn down to our fabric. And then when we put the negative side of the snap down, it kind of wiggle wobbles, right? It kind of wiggles around. When we touch the edge of our flat snap, it doesn't wiggle wobble nearly as much. So we're going to start with our positive snap. And so we're going to do the same thing. We're going to mark a dot. Do I have time to do snaps? Maybe. I'm going to go through this real fast, y'all. All right, so we have time to mark a dot, or we mark a dot, and we're going to do the same thing as with our button. We're going to do our little X. Boom. And that's just going to give our snap a little bit of stability. We're going to come up through the center, like so. And now we're going to take our flat snap, our positive snap, and we're going to center it so that the center of the snap is right on top of that little X. And so now our thread is coming out in between the snap and the fabric. And from here, we're going to go down, pick an eyelet, it doesn't matter which one. We're going to go down through the eyelet and then come back up on the outside of the snap and then go back down through the eyelet again. And we're going to do that 6 times on each eyelet. And Adrian is giving me 5 minutes. So we're actually not going to finish the snap, but the principle holds the same for all 8 eyelets. And I want to show you a pretty cool trick here. Boop. All right, so once you have done your 6, you're going to come up on the outside of the snap, and we're going to travel underneath the snap, come up through the eyelet, and you're going to do the same thing. We want that traveling thread to be hidden underneath the snap. We don't want it to be on the outside of the snap because it has the tendency to catch and your snap may fall off. The thread may break and the snap may fall off. And you're going to do that all the way around all 4 sides of the snap. And then we're going to do our little knot off, just like we did at the base of the shank on our button. So the last thing I want to show you before we have to, unfortunately, go, we've got a webinar right after this that we got to share. We're going to go ahead and show you how to mark the opposite side of the snap using the positive snap that we just sewed on. So the easy way to make sure that your garment that's snapping is going to line up is you can take one of these pieces of chalk. Remember we talked about that an hour and a half ago? This little piece of chalk, and you can color right on top of that little rod. Fold it over to where you want it to close. Press down on it, and that's going to create your dot. I usually just go back in with a pencil. Just make sure that chalk doesn't brush away. And that is going to perfectly align your snap as long as you're centering your negative snap directly on top of that dot. All right, so, well, I encourage you, if you are interested in getting some hands-on experience and you want to do the do part of the think and do with our How to Theater Think and Do, go onto our website, and that is theater.arts.ncsu.edu, and I think Adrian is tossing that into the chat. And go ahead and register for next week's due. We do have a limited number of seats available just because of social distancing or physical distancing. We want to make sure that everybody stays safe. So we do unfortunately have to limit the number of folks who come in, but we really want to give y'all a opportunity to get your hands on some fabric, get your hands on some needles, and really learn how to do these things. And Adrian and I will be there to guide you along the way. So thank you so much for joining us at our first spring semester How to Theater, and we will see you next time.